Hello again, this is Kevin Stoda, and this is the second part of our story. We're telling you the story of the revolutions of 1989. I'd already produced the first part before today, but right now I want to tell you about the second part, and I began in Czechoslovakia. The second part of the second part begins in Budapest. Please follow this and share it with your friends at Kevin Stoda YouTube. Budapest, 1987. Pre-revolution, evolution? 2 years before heading to Prague, I had made a trip to Budapest. That was 1987, of course. Similar to Czechoslovakia, several other decades earlier, Hungarians had tried to put a more human face on communism. That was 1956, just as the world was focusing on Egypt taking over the Suez Canal. And during this time, the Soviet Union went ahead and marched into communist Hungary and said that you can't have a communism with a human face. And the Hungarians were slaughtered by the Soviet forces. Note, for some political reviewers, this would be similar to the passivity today that the West shows in, for example, the invasion of the island off the Ukraine that the Soviet Union took over a few years back. In the face of the Soviet squashing of people's protests and marches in places like Georgia, or pressure that they put on Georgia, and within its own nation's state, Russia has punished many people who wanted or sought some sort of autonomy under them. On the other hand, I should note, Russia is, by 1989, pulling back from Afghanistan. On the other hand, 30 years before, like in the period after 1956, when the Marxists in Hungary had tried to forge their own past, there was some success, and it became called, what do you call it? Okay, goulash communism. Even though 1956 came out as a tragic defeat, in which at least 20,000 Hungarian workers were killed and countless others injured, imprisoned, and forced into hiding or exile, it nevertheless was undoubtedly the most significant event of the decade in the Stalinist states, since the consolidation of the bureaucracy around Stalin in the 1920s. It was also part and parcel of other unrest you found within other parts of Europe. It was the most vivid confirmation of the perspectives of Trotsky that the workers under Stalinist dictatorship, far from accepting their conditions or demanding a return to capitalism, would move in a political revolution to take power in their own hands. The tremendously inspiring events of the Hungarian October in 1956 are full of lessons for the workers of Eastern Europe and the whole world. This is what the East knew. This is what the Westerners should have known about the Easterners as 1989 approached. Looking back on the 1950s, i.e. a time when America's most cynical anti-communists were painting the decade as the world's final stand against an all-encompassing, but in many ways imaginary monster or unitary communism called the Soviet Union, European communism was actually being challenged on numerous fronts. Earlier in that same decade, Tito had already taken Yugoslavia on its own course. Under Tito, Yugoslavia would follow the path of the non-aligned movement, like India did. Albania would eventually soon find its way into Chinese orbit, and later other countries like Nicaragua would move on in their own direction. These events took place in the 1950s as Khrushchev took over the Kremlin, and the end of Stalinism had finally come into question as the raison d'etat in the Soviet Union's own communism. It was no longer held as a truism that communism needed to be seated firmly in the Soviet Union by the 1960s. The whole of the Eastern Bloc was awash with discontent. The floodgates were open in 1953 with protests in East Berlin, and then in Pilsen, in Prague, Czechoslovakia, The Hungarians protested, and then Odz and Szepel and Diszgyőr and other places had protests. Even within the Soviet Union, there had been strikes and protests against the prisoners, amongst the prisoners within the labor camps. In May 1956, vast numbers of Soviet troops and armored vehicles were needed to be sent to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, in order to crush a rebellion there. In short, there were challenges everywhere for the Soviet Union. A common image in the East and European communist circles was that Soviet Union's bigwigs were eating fat, while communist parties and peoples outside the Soviet Union were having to scrounge on what the Soviet occupations left behind. In short, from the time of death of Stalin through the collapse of the Soviet Union 45 years later, Eastern European peoples and states were often looking either for economic or political freedom, and some were willing to challenge the Russian bear to get it. Often, though, as was the case in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, both the people and anti-Soviet portions of the Communist Party leadership had been forced to back down. I should note that is, it was almost always anticipated that the rise of the independent union, any independent union in Eastern Europe, such as Solidarność in 1980, would lead to crackdown. However, miraculously, as the 1980s unfolded, this did not happen. Why did it not happen? Well, mainly because in 1982, Brezhnev died. He was the premier of the Soviet Union and had been for decades. In 1983, Andropov died. He was the new premier for only 1 year. And in 1985, Chernenko died. That meant by 1986, the world had a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. It's almost like 3 generations of people died off in the first years of the Reagan administration. And this created a chance for reform. It wasn't the amount of money America was wasting on military spending. It was some miracle from above. Certainly by 1982, Hungary was doing many things that no other communist country had been doing before. For example, that year, Hungary became the first Comecon nation to enter both GATT and the IMF. Comecon was roughly the Eastern European equivalent to the rise of the European Economic Community in the West. Soon, Hungary's trade with non-Comecon states, especially West Germany and Austria, outgrew its trade relations with Comecon. In other words, goulash Hungarian communism, as it grew from 1956 onwards, was marked by greater concern for the material well-being of citizens. In short, over the decades, in evolutionary fashion, Hungary's communism was mobilized to better satisfy consumer demand by providing a more extensive assortment of goods. This included allowing limited numbers of market mechanisms to function rather freely in Hungary. I witnessed many of the scenes of this market opening communist firsthand as I arrived in September 1987 in Budapest. Let me explain. In fact, the city of Budapest was much more opulent than either Prague or East Berlin, which I had already visited several times. However, unlike in East Germany, where I didn't see much poverty, it was hidden, in Hungary, I could see people sleeping in the train stations. Maybe beggars, maybe travelers, maybe gypsies, all kinds of people were sleeping in the train station when we arrived. Loads of retirees and entrepreneurs, though, arrived at the station each day in Vienna for the train coming from Vienna, and they would hope to find passengers who were willing to pay to sleep at their apartments. At the Hungarian embassy in Vienna, I had met, by the way, 2 Jews from Latin America, and we had decided to stick together, travel together, and rent an apartment upon our arrival in Budapest. Alas, when we arrived and were surrounded by this mass of people trying to get a few of us to come to their house, we felt very threatened. The touts and the senior citizens at the Budapest station that day were a bit aggressive, and the few tourists showing up, they outnumbered quickly, And I said, I just pretended to sleep. I said, I was tired. We'd been up all night because we had to take an early morning train, so we stayed in the station that night and got out, I think, 3 or 4 o'clock from Vienna. I told the hawkers that I was prepared to sleep there on the floor. At that moment, a man named Georgi Bakunin came to our rescue. Georgi happened to be in the Buda train station awaiting friends from Sweden that day, and he took pity on the 3 of us as we were surrounded as travelers. Observing our tiredness and our readiness just to camp out and sleep on the floor that afternoon or that night, many other European and gypsies were also doing that. Georgi came and spoke in a calming manner to us, and then to the other Hungarians who were trying to harass us and to come into their place. He said we were his friends and they'd come to his house. Of course, he said that in Hungarian, but he later told me. Finally, Georgi announced, I am George, and I have a free apartment for you, 3 people. You see, Georgi was an electrical engineer. He was in his 30s. He'd worked especially hard to get his degree, his job, and his English skills. Georgi usually slept with his girlfriends at her apartment in the city, though, rather than at his own apartment. His stable government job had afforded him not much money, but it had given him a large apartment in the suburbs or outskirts of the city. However, the commute was very, very long for the average Hungarian worker, and so he preferred to sleep in the city and have a social life at night. In prior years in that decade, Georgi had also tried to make a bit of extra money in summer by coming to the station and inviting people to stay at his house. That way he had made his friends from Sweden who he thought were on a return visit. But due to telecommunication issues in Hungary, he wasn't able to get the full information of whether they were coming or not over the phone that day, so he had shown up after cleaning his house and preparing it for his guest. His guest from Scandinavia had been able to get a hold of him at the last minute, but he decided then, since he didn't have any guests, he would invite us 3 foreigners to stay at his place. He gave us his key after taking us out to the far corner of the city and dropping us at his flat in the suburbs. It was a huge, nice flat. There was a refrigerator and everything. He gave it to us for free for 3 or 4 days. And he basically worked, and we were able to meet him 3 days later in the afternoon or evening, and we went out on the town. We went to the New York, the Cafe New York, which is quite famous. And the 2 Jewish friends of mine went home early because they also wanted to save money. And I went out with Georgi that night to hear some jazz and blues in the city. I came home that night and on the train, and Georgi came with me for a change. He didn't sleep in the city that night. We got up the next morning and enjoyed paprika. Paprika for breakfast, yes! I think that he had cream cheese too, sort of cream cheese. And we would slice the green paprika, the red paprika, orange paprika, or yellow paprika, and we would eat it. And that's what he had for breakfast, which was interesting because that was kind of like a legend. One saw it in travel books that the, goulash, that they use a lot of paprika in Hungary. And Georgi laughed when I told him this and what was said about paprika eating peoples in Hungary. Through his word, Georgi gave the 3 strangers, including myself, this wonderful flat to stay at. On our last night, we had a good time together, but on that morning, Georgi also took me back out. I felt like he was a guardian angel. Georgi took us back took me back to the station where I was heading to Sopron for the day and then on to Vienna. And he made sure I was safe and got on the train like a good host. And I wondered, is he an example of the new human being, the new human, the new man that Soviet or communism had talked about all these years? I'd heard a similar story about communism and socialism and the new man, and the story of Nicaragua. I'd been there in 1983 during the Sandinistas' early years. I visited open air farm. I was with international development class, and we went that one day to an open air farm. The prisoners were allowed to work there, and if they wanted to, they could go a few nights a week to visit their families, as well as coming back the next day. They were trusted to do so. It was a very unusual situation. I met ex-somosista, that was the butcher Somoza, as one of his officers, and this ex-general